"Will, are you still lingering here?" Mrs. Lewis inquired, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "Don't you have some responsibilities or duties to attend to?" "Actually, not at this moment, Mrs. Lewis," replied Will, his tone underpinned by a slight plea. "You see, they haven't admitted any severe cases today, so I've wrapped all of my assigned tasks. If you don't mind, may I stay here a little longer? I hope you don't feel the need to send me away. Remember, I'm using this time to prepare myself for my forthcoming educational journey." Mrs. Lewis, a seasoned nurse, let out a weary sigh. "Interesting. I wasn't under the impression you were particularly invested in such pursuits," she countered. "At a glance, it seems like you're merely idling away your time here, not doing anything productive. Wouldn't it be better to dive into your textbooks?" "Mrs. Lewis, my time here isn't wasted," Will responded earnestly. "I may not be actively working, but I'm soaking up invaluable hands-on experience." Mrs. Lewis responded with a disheartened shake of her head, fully understanding the subtext of Will's statement about gaining experience. Olivia was the experience Will was seeking, not the professional kind, but rather a romantic interest. She was the reason behind his frequent, lingering visits to this particular department. Olivia was an undeniable beauty, possessing an allure that was hard to ignore. However, her beauty was offset by an air of arrogance that clung to her like a second skin. Her personality was akin to that of a serpent, slick and potentially treacherous. There he stood, Will, a fully grown man, smitten by the enchanting but aloof Olivia. It could be argued that his infatuation was a personal matter, one in which others had no right to interfere. Yet Mrs. Lewis couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for him. He was a good young man, compassionate, always ready to lend a helping hand. However, Mrs. Lewis harbored a firm conviction, a gut feeling born from years of observing human behavior. She was certain that Olivia would never return Will's affectionate sentiments. She understood the likely heartbreak that awaited Will, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. Will, a former soldier, had chosen to transition into the medical field after his military service. The aspiration to become a healthcare professional had been nestled in his heart for quite a while. The timing had not been right until now. It seemed he was finally preparing for the journey. When he first dived into the world of medicine, he wasn't enticed by the prospect of a hefty paycheck. Rather, he was intrigued by the inner workings of nursing, the direct impact on patients' lives that the profession promised. Mrs. Lewis was confident that Will would excel as a medical professional. Not only did he possess an impressive intellect, but he also showed genuine interest in patients' experiences, consistently demonstrating a heartfelt desire to help them. What stood out about Will was his palpable enthusiasm to be a doctor. This ambition was so apparent that Mrs. Lewis couldn't help but notice it. She knew his dreams could indeed become a reality, provided Olivia didn't shatter his resilience. Fortunately, that day, Olivia was off duty. It was Dakota's shift instead, which would commence later in the evening. Dakota was a charming and humble girl, hailing from a rural farming community. Her family was comprised of hard-working farmers, and her upbringing was a reflection of their humble and diligent lifestyle. Dakota was a generous individual, always willing to lend a helping hand to those in need. It was a trait ingrained in her through her upbringing. While Olivia performed her duties as per her job description, like administering injections or measuring patients' blood pressures, Dakota went above and beyond. She was known to assist the janitorial staff in moving equipment through the corridors or to help change bad linens in the wards whenever she had spare time. Dakota's actions illustrated her innate kindness and her commitment to the well-being of the hospital community. That evening, as Dakota was beginning her shift, the department phone trilled into life. She picked it up, listening attentively to the caller. After a moment, she asked the person on the other end to hold on and turned to Will. "They've brought in an elderly woman. They need some assistance. Could you go down?" she asked. With a swift nod, Will rushed down to reception. The old woman lay unconscious on a gurney, her frail form inspiring a deep sadness in Will's eyes. "What happened?" Will questioned the paramedic. "Was it a car accident?" "No," replied the paramedic, shaking his head. "She was found at her home. The specifics are unclear at the moment. Her neighbors discovered her on the staircase." Will's gaze returned to the elderly woman, concern etched on his face. "She's in pretty rough shape," he observed quietly. Considering her age, it's uncertain if she'll pull through. The medical team transported the woman to the intensive care unit. Will was frequently present by her side, providing whatever assistance he could. In time, the attending physician, Dr. Andrews, started examining her scans. "Hey, intern," he called out to Will. "Take a look at these. You might learn something." Will scrutinized the scans for an extended period, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary to his untrained eye. He handed the scans back, admitting, "I'm not sure if I'm supposed to spot anything specific, but I don't see anything unusual." "That's okay. It's common when you're just starting," Dr. Andrews reassured him. "But you're correct. There's nothing amiss in these scans. However, her body does show signs of extensive bruising." Will looked at the doctor, his surprise evident. "So, what does that imply?" "Why don't you mull over it during your shift?" Dr. Andrews suggested, a small smile playing on his lips. "In the morning, we'll discuss our respective findings." Will nodded his understanding. Dr. Andrews often challenged them with problems to solve, a task he usually managed well. This was another such puzzle, and as he paced in the wake of the doctor, he turned over every word in his mind. The answers seemed just beyond his reach. Dr. Andrews frequently advised, "Knowing the cause of the disease is the key to curing it. It's essential to eliminate the cause." While Will didn't fully subscribe to this notion, he acknowledged there was a kernel of truth in it. Turning to Dakota, Dr. Andrews instructed, "Ensure you monitor her blood pressure hourly. Administer painkillers as necessary. That's her course of action for now." "Understood, Dr. Andrews. So, what's her story?" Dakota inquired. Dr. Andrews glanced at Will, replying, "We'll hear Will's take on it in the morning." Dakota smiled, looking at Will. "Giving him some training, huh?" "Indeed," Dr. Andrews replied, grinning back at Will. "Unless, of course, he's not interested in becoming a real doctor." Will devoted the entire night to scouring the internet for any insights that could help him solve this medical puzzle. Occasionally, he would return to the old woman's bedside, observing her condition closely. He noticed the emergence of tiny crimson-blue marks scattered across her body, which he recognized as bruises. Dr. Andrews had been correct in his assessment. The patterns of bruising were inconsistent with a simple fall. For these marks to appear as they did, the woman would have had to tumble down the stairs multiple times and in a variety of ways. Lost in a sea of hypotheses, Will struggled to find a plausible explanation. However, as often happens with elusive answers, the solution dawned on him while he was deep in slumber. As morning drew near, a weary Will found himself succumbing to sleep on the couch. In his dreams, he revisited the terrifying memory from his childhood. He saw his younger self, barely 6 or 7 years old, seated on the living room sofa. His mother busied herself in the kitchen while his father was at work. Will eagerly waited his father's return, anticipating an evening lesson in the enchanting game of chess. During this time, Will's family resided in a small, tight-knit town, a place where everyone was familiar with everyone else. The locals could even identify their neighbors' dogs at a glance. The sense of community was strong, and the low crime rate meant that people rarely felt the need to lock their doors. When the front door slammed shut, Will's mother flashed a knowing smile from the kitchen, announcing, "Here comes Daddy." But as she turned to greet her husband, her smile faded into a look of sheer disbelief. Her voice trembled as she stammered, "What are you doing here?" A stranger stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a malicious grin. Young Will instinctively recoiled, feeling an ominous aura emanating from the man. The stranger sneered. "Can't even muster a polite good evening, huh? Weren't expecting me, were you, wifey?" "I'm not your wife. I haven't been for 5 years." "Why are you here?" she responded, her voice trembling but defiant. "Easy there, wifey." "Stop that. Stop calling me that. I'm not your wifey." "That was your decision, wasn't it? Have you ever stopped to think if I had a say in it too? Probably not." Simon held her gaze, allowing a tense silence to fill the room. "Nobody bothered to ask me. Nobody cared about my feelings. Would you like to hear my opinion?" His voice rose in pitch, seething with resentment. "I disagree with your decision. I don't think it's fair for a man to clean grimy prison floors while his wife flits about enjoying life with someone else." A sly grin spread across Simon's face, quickly morphing into a scowl. "Simon, you need to leave," Catherine implored, concern etched into her features. "You're scaring Will." "That's my son," Simon countered, his tone chillingly nonchalant. "He should get used to my rules." Catherine was growing increasingly impatient, sensing the escalating tension. Her voice rose as she retorted, "He's not going to adjust to anything. He has a father already, and I have a husband." Taking a deep breath, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please, Simon," she pleaded softly. "Please leave." Simon remained silent, seeming to contemplate her plea. He raised his eyebrows in a silent response, as if to say, "Well, looks like you've chosen the hard way." He laid his hand on the wall, stepping further into the room. He took in the surroundings, his eyes skimming over the photographs lining the walls. He meandered towards them, pausing to examine a picture of Catherine's new husband. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, erupting into a small chuckle. Continuing his slow exploration, he casually picked up various items, only to set them back in place. As he drifted past Catherine, she watched them warily from the corners of her eyes. Her breaths were heavy and quick, her anxiety evident in each exhale. "Get out," she seethed through clenched teeth. No sooner had the words left her mouth than a harsh blow struck her cheek. The next moment, Simon's fists were raining down on her. When she crumbled to the floor, he continued his assault, his feet now the weapons of choice. Will sprang into action, rushing to his mother's defense. With a shrill scream, he lunged at Simon, sinking his teeth into the man's hand with all the might his small frame could muster. Caught off guard, Simon yanked his hand away with such force that Will was flung across the room. His small body collided with the wall, and the impact knocked him unconscious instantly. The subsequent events would only become known to Will later. The man he knew as his father, Jim, burst into the room from outside. He snatched up the baseball bat that was propped against the wall by the entrance and hurled himself at Simon. The brutal altercation ended as quickly as it had begun. The sight of his wife in distress and his unconscious son in the corner fueled Jim's rage. In a blind fit of emotion, he did what everyone might have done in such a frenzied state. The court sentenced Jim to prison for manslaughter. The initial year in confinement took a significant toll on his mental health. He fell ill with pneumonia, a condition from which he would never recover, despite the doctor's efforts. Catherine spent a lengthy period in the hospital, her injuries eerily similar to those of the elderly woman now under Will's care in the ICU. Will awoke from his sleep, drenched in sweat. Their recurring dream always culminated in the same traumatic scene of him colliding with the wall and slipping into unconsciousness. When Will was of an age to comprehend the implications, Catherine narrated the disturbing events of that fateful day. Before their marriage, Simon had seemed perfect in every way. He had been charming and generous during their courtship, which led her to believe they could build a beautiful life together. However, after they wed, their seemingly idyllic family life turned into a living nightmare for Catherine. Simon's behavior began to change drastically. He was carelessly extravagant, squandering money despite lacking a stable job, yet he always seemed to have what he wanted. After Will's birth, Catherine started suspecting that Simon was involved in some sort of illicit activities, possibly linked to the local gang. Numerous times she urged him to abandon his murky dealings and lead a law-abiding life. When her pleas fell on deaf ears, she beseeched him to reconsider for the sake of their son. His smirking response was etched vividly in her memory. "Are you suggesting I should become a factory worker like you and your pathetic father?" "Why not? At least then Will wouldn't have to feel ashamed of his father in the future." For the first time in her life, she was subjected to physical abuse that day. In response, Catherine immediately left Simon. The very next day, he was apprehended for robbery and sent to jail. Naturally, Will retained no memories of his biological father. Catherine filed for divorce shortly thereafter. A year later, she married again, this time to a man who genuinely cared for her and her son. Jim was a kind-hearted individual who treated Will as if he were his own. In Will's mind, Jim was his true father. In the present day, Catherine continued to work at the factory, notorious for its harmful emissions. Will stared ahead, deep in thought. The elderly woman in the ICU was over 70 years old. Who could be so heartless as to harm such a frail person? Despite his attempts, he struggled to connect the dots, unable to draw a definitive conclusion. He began to doubt the validity of his hypothesis. As it neared the time for Dr. Andrews to arrive, Will completed his duties for the shift. Noticing Dr. Andrews at his usual spot, Will realized that the doctor had already visited the elderly patient. "Dakota, could you fetch the test results, please? If everything's in order, we'll transfer her to a regular ward." "On it, Dr. Andrews." As Dr. Andrews turned, he spotted Will approaching. Here comes our future doctor. So, what have you deduced?" Will met the doctor's gaze with a solemn expression. "I've got a theory, but I'm not sure it's something you'll find particularly impressive." As Will began to lay out his findings, Olivia arrived to switch shifts with Dakota. He was so engrossed in his discussion with Dr. Andrews that he didn't notice her entrance. "I'm all ears, Will. Your time to shine. Go ahead." Glancing at his notes, Will began to explain. "Well, you see, Dr. Andrews, everything suggests that she was the victim of physical assault. What I don't understand is why the neighbors didn't report it in that case. And I'm stuck trying to figure out who could beat her up like that." Dr. Andrews sighed. "Well, I'm not surprised. Not by you, but with your conclusion. Part of our job is to assist the police in answering exactly those kind of questions." Overhearing the conversation, Olivia smirked and interjected. "Come on, you guys. You don't need to be a detective to figure out what happened. Look at her. Another drunkard who probably brawled over a bottle of whiskey with her husband or something." Dakota nudged her lightly in the side, but it did little to temper Olivia's words. If anything, she grew louder. "Am I wrong? These people drink like fish and fight, and we end up wasting our time trying to save them. We shouldn't bother. Society would be cleaner without them." Dr. Andrews turned towards her with a stern gaze. "Olivia, I sincerely hope you never fall ill. And if you do, I hope you'll be fortunate enough to have people around you who will care for you." With that, Dr. Andrews turned and left the room. Olivia then shifted her attention to Will, batting her eyelashes playfully. She was aware of Will's feelings for her and often used this to get him to do her bidding. But her next request and the dismissive way she made it gave Will a pause. "Will, can you get me a cup of coffee?" For a moment, Will's mind was elsewhere, pondering over something completely different. Olivia's request didn't seem out of place to him initially, but when he snapped back to reality, he realized the way she had asked was deeply inappropriate. Her complete disregard for the elderly woman's plight was shocking and made him reconsider his feelings for her. As he uttered the words, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He no longer had the obligation to please Olivia in the hopes of winning her over. "No," she shook his head. "You can get your own coffee. You have 2 working legs." Dakota, who was in the process of filling out a report sheet, struggled to hide a grin. The surprised expression on Olivia's face was priceless. The next day, Will's first order of business was to visit the ward where Mrs. Owen had been transferred. On entering, he asked about her condition. She responded that she was feeling much better thanks to the painkillers. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling better, ma'am. If you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know." Just as Will was about to leave the ward, Mrs. Owen called out to him. She took a deep breath before speaking, clearly struggling with her decision to ask him for help. "Excuse me, Will. I know this might sound strange, but I don't know who else to turn to. I can't reach my house. It's probably locked. I need some things. Do you think you could bring them to me? I can give you some money." "Of course, Mrs. Owen. What do you need?" "Oh, it's not much at all. Just a few items from the store and some fruit." That evening, Will told his mother about the old lady. Catherine packed a few items for Mrs. Owen. She was so worried for the elderly woman that her blood pressure shot up. For her, the thought of being alone and helpless was terrifying. The next day, Mrs. Owen was visibly surprised as Will unpacked the items his mother had sent. "Will, you didn't take the cash last night. Did you pay for these things yourself?" "Mrs. Owen, my mother is an elderly woman like you, and when I told her about you, she was concerned. These are the things she wanted to give to you." "Your mother is such a kind-hearted woman. Thank you both so much. But this is too much. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me." "Don't worry about that. The important thing is that you eat well and stay healthy." "Thank you so much. Could I please repay you?" "That's not necessary, Mrs. Owen. It's not a problem at all. Now, please get some rest. We're going to look for your relatives. You do have relatives, right? Yes, I do have a son, Mrs. Owen confessed, a glimmer of sadness crossing her frail features. Will couldn't help but wonder why the son had not yet arrived to check on his ailing mother. He must be worried about you. We'll contact him, and I'm sure he'll be here soon. For now, you just focus on getting your strength back, reassured Will, turning to leave the room. Suddenly, Mrs. Owen's feeble hand lashed onto his arm, a sense of urgency in her eyes. Will, could you do me a favor? Could you tell my son that I won't survive, or that I'm already dead? I'd do anything to keep him away, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Shocked at her words, Will turned to face her. Was it your son? Did he hurt you? He inquired, a sinking feeling in his stomach. Tears welled up in Mrs. Owen's eyes as she quickly shook her head. No, it wasn't him. It was my fault. But please tell him I'm no more. Will was left reeling from her words. He couldn't wrap his head around it. Why would a son hurt his own mother like that? He thought about his own mom and felt a chill run down his spine. The very idea seemed grotesque to him. Shaken, he paced down the corridor, shaking his head in an attempt to banish the distressing thoughts. At that moment, Mrs. Lewis, another nurse, approached him. Will, are you all right? Why are you shaking your head like that? Also, the old woman has some visitors. Seems like it's her son. He doesn't seem too friendly if you ask me, she shared. Will's heart pounded at her words. He's the one who did this to her. He needs to be kept away from her. Mrs. Lewis looked at him in shock. Her son? Her own flesh and blood? Will, are you absolutely sure? Yes, Mrs. Lewis. Unfortunately, it's true. Where is he? I need to confront him. Will rushed towards the reception, with Mrs. Lewis trailing behind him, cautioning him not to make any rash decisions. Ignoring her, Will entered the reception and saw a scruffy man arguing heatedly with Dakota. Then when are visiting hours? I need to see my mother now. She's got all my cards. Do you expect me to starve? Dakota looked utterly confused. So your mother handles all your cards? That's none of your business. You ask too many questions. Will overheard their exchange and hastily retreated to Mrs. Owen's room to inform her about her son's arrival, mentioning the credit cards. Mrs. Owen's son, John, had been living with her for the past few years following his divorce. He had a rocky history, having been in and out of jail for offenses like drunk driving or even minor shoplifting. Jobless, he relied on his mother's pension to scrape by. Mrs. Owen, a retiree, found solace and joy in tending to her garden. She tried to persuade John to secure a job and take responsibility for his life. Initially, her attempts were gentle and patient, but John continually returned to his mother was pleased for more money. He gradually started exploiting her credit cards and soon made it a regular practice. Mrs. Owen lived a humble, frugal lifestyle, not really spending much of her pension. John, however, managed to convince his mother to let him handle her finances, promising to invest wisely in stocks. Initially hesitant, Mrs. Owen agreed to the proposal under the condition that John would attend rehab and give up his bad habits. John complied, but unbeknownst to Mrs. Owen, he left the rehab center within a week. A month later, John phoned his mother claiming steady improvement and even spoke of investing as a hobby. Leaving her son, Mrs. Owen felt a rush of hope and joy. When John returned home from rehab, he was clean, well-dressed, and trustworthy in appearance. It was all a facade to regain his mother's trust. As soon as he gained access to her cards again, he fell back into his destructive habits. The following months was filled with endless arguments and fights between the mother and son. Things escalated the day Mrs. Owen decided to revoke John's access to her cards. John arrived home drunk one day and demanded the cards. When Mrs. Owen refused, he violently assaulted her, pushing her down the stairs, and fled. Yet, even after such a horrifying incident, Mrs. Owen felt compelled to protect her son. She didn't want to involve the police, afraid of seeing her son behind bars. The situation overwhelmed her, and she yearned for a safe escape. She believed that if she could disappear, John would have no choice but to become independent. Will listened to Mrs. Owen's heartbreaking account and left her room, a burning rage simmering within him. He strode towards the reception, where he saw John arguing heatedly with Dakota. Without a second thought, Will stormed in and grabbed John by the collar. "You heartless beast! How could you harm your own mother? Will raged, lifting John off the ground by his collar. Who on earth are you? John spotted, his feet kicking the air. With a grunt, Will slammed him against the wall. Who am I? You're about to find out. From behind he heard Mrs. Lewis scream in alarm. Will, don't! Let him be. He's not worth it. Despite his righteous fury, Will knew he couldn't allow himself to be pulled into a violent confrontation. He could end up facing legal repercussions. With a final snarl, he heaved John towards the exit. If you dare to show your face around Mrs. Owen again, you'll regret it. John scrambled up and darted out of the hospital, but not before screaming back, You'll pay for this! You all will! Drained and shaken, Will sank to the floor, his chest heaving with sobs. His own painful past had been stirred up by the incident, memories of his mother, also a victim of abuse. Every time he witnessed violence against the weak, the traumatic images from his childhood haunted him. The police arrived at the hospital within an hour. Mrs. Lewis and Dakota earnestly explained how John had threatened to harm Mrs. Owen further if she didn't give in to his demands. They informed the police about the argument John had with the nurse who denied him access to the ward, and about the harsh words he had directed towards her. They maintained that Will hadn't hit John, but had merely escorted him out forcefully. Meanwhile, Dr. Andrews prepared a detailed injury report of Mrs. Owen and handed it to the police. Here's the evidence of physical abuse that this elderly lady endured at the hands of her own son. She intends to press charges. At Will's urging, Mrs. Owen had agreed to file a lawsuit against John. Will had told her that it didn't matter if the offender was her son. Justice was paramount, and everyone must face the consequences of their actions. One of the officers perused the injury report, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line he read. So, all of these injuries were inflicted by that man? Indeed. After taking statements and collecting the necessary information, the police left, promising to apprehend John. They assured everyone that the investigation would follow due process, and if the evidence stacked up, John could face at least 12 years in prison. 2 weeks after the harrowing incident, it was time for Mrs. Owen's discharge from the hospital. Will awaited her in the hallway. Will? Your mom's here. Have you seen her yet? Dakota asked, her voice filled with enthusiasm. Will returned her question with a warm smile. Yeah, she's here for me too. She wanted to see Mrs. Owen. As Mrs. Owen was being wheeled out of her ward, a look of concern etched her face. The sight didn't escape the notice of those present. How are you feeling, Mrs. Owen? Dakota asked, bestowing a warm smile upon the elderly woman. I'm feeling great. Thank you so much for asking, Mrs. Owen replied, managing a small smile of her own. Olivia lingered nearby, a forced smirk playing on her lips. Despite the outward show of indifference, a churning discomfort gnawed at her from within for her previous ill-spoken words about Mrs. Owen. However, she put on a brave face, doing her utmost to conceal her internal conflict. Mrs. Owen felt isolated and vulnerable, devoid of any immediate support. She was well aware that her choices were limited. Either employ a caregiver to assist her until she regained her strength, or muster the courage to brave the hardships on her own. Panic, like a creeping shadow, slowly began to envelop Mrs. Owen as she grappled with the harsh realities of her situation. Her heart pounded in her chest like a sledgehammer, matching the rhythm of her escalating fear. Each breath she took was shakier than the last, as she desperately tried to maintain her composure. The bustling hospital hallway seemed to shrink around her. The murmur of conversations and the clatter of medical equipment felt distant and hollow, as her own thoughts drowned out the world around her. It was then that her eyes fell upon Will, his warm smile offering a beacon of hope amidst her brewing storm of fear. Her heart steadied a little. At that moment, an elderly woman carrying a vibrant bouquet of flowers approached her, a warm smile illuminating her face. Hello, Carol. I'm Catherine, Will's mother. I've heard that you have quite the green thumb. I could really use some guidance in my backyard. By the way, what kind of fertilizers do you use? I've recently planted some petunias and... Mrs. Owen sat there, utterly taken aback as Catherine carried on. The elderly woman was a whirlwind of energy and chatter, posing questions and providing her own answers in the same breath. Will approached the two women, a genuine smile spreading across his face. He then turned to Mrs. Owen, his voice filled with warmth. Normally, she doesn't talk this much, but I guess she hasn't had someone to talk to in a while. Mrs. Owen's initial confusion and surprise slowly transformed into a serene expression, her face now adorned with a peaceful smile. The weight of her worries momentarily lifted as she found herself swept up in the lively conversation with Catherine. The two women connected instantly, their shared love for gardening bridging the gap between them. Catherine's genuine interest and willingness to listen brought solace to Mrs. Owen's heart. It was as if a spark of companionship had been ignited, brightening the path ahead. In that moment, Mrs. Owen realized that she wasn't as alone as she had feared. The presence of Will and now Catherine reminded her that there were people who genuinely cared and were willing to offer their support. The once looming panic began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of hope and camaraderie. A few days before Mrs. Owen's scheduled discharge, Will and his mother Catherine had a heartfelt discussion and made a compassionate decision. They both recognized the challenges that Mrs. Owen faced and understood the importance of providing her with ongoing support. With empathy in their hearts, Will and Catherine decided to take care of Mrs. Owen. They knew that her circumstances were difficult, and they wanted to ensure that she didn't have to face them alone. They saw the strength and resilience in Mrs. Owen, and they believed that she deserved a helping hand during this transitional period. Together, they made arrangements to accommodate Mrs. Owen's needs. They prepared a comfortable room for her in their home, ensuring that she would have a peaceful and nurturing environment. They also arranged for any necessary medical equipment and supplies to be readily available, understanding that her well-being was of utmost importance. Will recognized that his mother Catherine could benefit from the companionship and shared understanding that would come from caring for someone like Mrs. Owen. He understood that his mother's retirement years had been marked by a sense of loneliness and a longing for meaningful connections. Seeing the parallel experiences of abuse in their stories, Will realized that Mrs. Owen's presence in their home could bring solace and healing not just to her, but also to his mother. It was an opportunity for them to support and uplift one another, forming a bond built on empathy and shared experiences. Dakota peered at Will, her eyes widening in admiration. A wave of warmth enveloped her heart, kindled by Will's considered action. Remaining silent, she stood in place, her gaze fixed on him, her lips curving into an unfeigned smile. Catching her quiet observation, Will swiveled around, and for the first time, he took note of the captivating sparkle in her eyes. "Can I help out with your gardening?" Dakota asked, her voice filled with a playful tone. She held a deep respect for the family's kindness and yearned to give something back by looking after Mrs. Owen as well. Will's face lit up in a responsive smile. "Absolutely. Feel free to join us any time. And keep in mind, our doors are always open, not just for gardening." With that affirmation, the group ambled out of the building, leaving Dakota alone. She stood watching, her eyes tracing their departing figures until they disappeared from sight. "That's a good lad." Startled, Dakota spun around to find Mrs. Lewis standing behind her. "I believe he's the finest young man I've encountered yet," she admitted with conviction. A mere 7 days had rolled by, and surprisingly, Mrs. Owen's recent hospital stay had almost vanished from her memory. Had it not been for the restricting yet supportive wheelchair she was obliged to use, the elderly woman might have completely disregarded the incident. They chatted about yesteryears and new age innovations, discussed delightful recipes and books that helped their interest, reminisced about favorite vacation spots, and even debated on matters of the heart. In a shy, almost hesitant voice, Dakota expressed to Will her desire to visit and spend some time with his family. On hearing this, Will fought hard to maintain his composure to not let the excitement seeping through his veins become apparent. Within him, a fountain of joy was threatening to explode. The girl he had been secretly cherishing had expressed an interest in spending time with his family. With an admirable poker face, he watched as Dakota walked away to resume her usual rounds with the patients. The moment she was out of sight, Will darted into a nearby room, safely away from prying eyes. Unable to contain his joy any longer, he let out a triumphant yell, the sound of pure elation reverberating through the empty space. His heart raced with joy, the anticipation of Dakota's impending visit lighting up his world. News of the blooming connection between Dakota and Will spread like wildfire through the hospital corridors. A wave of collective happiness washed over the staff. their faces lighting up with smiles at the thought of the delightful pairing. Fast forward a few months, and Will and Dakota were officially a couple. Their weekends were a pleasant blend of laughter, comfort, and shared affection spent at home with Catherine and Mrs. Owen. Dakota's sense of humor was infectious, her witty comments and amusing anecdotes adding a playful energy to their gatherings. Dakota had not only won over Will's heart, but she had also captured the hearts of his family. One sunny afternoon, as they lounged in their backyard, the soft chime of the doorbell pierced the tranquil ambience. Dakota, who was closer to the house, volunteered to see who it was. The sight that greeted her as she opened the door was utterly unexpected. Olivia stood on their doorstep, a freshly baked, warm apple pie cradled in her hands. The tantalizing aroma of the pie wafted through the air, tempting Dakota's senses. "No, I don't have any romantic feelings for Will, so you don't need to worry," Olivia quickly clarified, reading the surprise on Dakota's face. "He's just not my type. I'm here to apologize for the harsh words I said in the past." A sigh of relief and a broad smile spread across Dakota's face. She reached out, welcoming Olivia in a comforting hug. The gesture was received warmly, and Olivia's expression softened. Dakota took the pie from Olivia's hands, admiring the perfectly golden crust and the sweet scent of apples and cinnamon. The rest of the afternoon passed in peaceful camaraderie. They sat together in the living room, the tensions of the past set aside. They nibbled on the delicious apple pie, washing it down with warm, aromatic tea, the atmosphere imbued with newfound understanding and friendship.